General Threll Vantic did not offer me a weapon. He did not offer me a trial. He offered me one question because that is what the Kaelthir Dominion grants the defeated, so that even a lesser species may die informed. I was not supposed to use it on him. They had taken the Halloway 4 hours earlier, boarding through a hull breach my own crew had failed to patch in time, and marched what was left of the bridge staff into a holding bay that smelled of ozone and something like burnt copper. The Marines who did the marching never spoke to us, not because they'd been ordered to stay silent, but because, I understood later, addressing a defeated crew directly is a minor breach of assembly etiquette. The same way a person doesn't make small talk with something they're about to dispose of. We sat on a bench welded to the floor, wrists bound in a restraint mesh that hummed faintly against the skin, and waited the better part of an hour before anyone in command cast plating walked through the door. The Kaelthir called this a ritual of terminal clarity. Their formal transcript, later recovered from the ship's black box, read, "Subject is granted one interrogative exchange prior to disposition, in accordance with Assembly Statute 4, so that the defeated species may not claim ignorance of its own failure." It was the most polite sentence anyone had ever used to describe an execution. Someone in the Assembly's legal division had, at some point in the last several centuries, sat down and drafted this statute with the same care a person puts into a will. And I remember thinking absurdly that I respected the effort even as I hated what it was for. Vantic delivered the line himself in English, with the kind of pronunciation that comes from decades of study rather than translation software. He was tall in the way their command cast always is, plated in gray-blue chitin that caught the light like wet slate, and he smiled the way a teacher smiles at a student who has just failed an exam they were never going to pass. "You may ask one thing," he said. "I encourage you to ask something useful your predecessors rarely did." Behind him, a junior officer read the rest of the statute aloud in Kaelthir first and English second, and the translation was so relentlessly polite, it took me a moment to understand what it was actually saying. That disposition would proceed regardless of the content of the exchange, that the statute existed to preserve assembly dignity, not to alter outcome. They had written a law about being nice to the people they were about to kill. Somewhere behind me, one of my crew made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The rest of the bridge staff had gone quiet, the particular quiet of people doing math on how much time they have left. I was the only one who wasn't afraid, and I want to be honest about why. I wasn't afraid because I already knew something Vantic didn't, and I had been waiting 11 months for someone to ask me the right question so I could stop pretending I didn't know it. My name is Amara Voss. I ran signals analysis for the Aegis Compact's contact division, a job title that meant in practice that I spent most of my career reading garbage, and that the 2 times before this one when I'd flagged something as significant and turned out to be right, the correction to my file happened quietly and the credit went somewhere else. I had learned to stop expecting to be believed on the first pass. I had not learned to stop noticing things. 3 years ago, after the Kaelthir's first survey contact, the Assembly had presented Earth with a gift. A decommissioned relay probe category disposal offered as what their communique called a charitable transfer commemorating first contact. It was junk. Everyone said so. My director said so in a meeting where he used the word trinket twice. I said nothing, because I had already noticed the probe's transmitter array was drawing power it shouldn't have needed, and I've learned that the fastest way to lose an argument is to have it before you have proof. So I didn't ask Vantic for mercy. I asked him a different question, in a room where every other human present expected me to beg. Why has your fleet's telemetry been broadcasting in our reserved frequency band for the past 11 months? Vantic's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, a small recalibration. The look of a man discovering that the floor he was standing on was not the floor he thought it was. The probe was junk the way a locked door is a wall, only to someone who never tries the handle. Its real discovery didn't come from me, it came from Dr. Bonsu, a hardware analyst who'd spent 4 years being quietly excluded from contact division meetings. Ever since he wrote a paper arguing something the department chair once called, in an email Bonsu still keeps printed above his desk, thermodynamically embarrassing. His argument, long before the Kaelthir ever arrived, was that any species advanced enough for interstellar travel would never hand a genuinely dead machine to another species. A dead machine reveals nothing, and a disposed one reveals exactly how much you think of the people receiving it. Bonsu had been right for 4 years with no evidence, which is a hard way to be right. When the probe arrived, he asked to be the first one inside it. He wasn't optimistic. He was correct, and he has told me since that those are different things, and that he prefers being correct. He opened the probe's housing alone in a secured bay at Compact headquarters, working through the outer plating with a torque driver instead of the cutting laser the protocol demanded, because he didn't trust a laser near a hull whose material composition nobody had verified. For For 11 minutes he said nothing at all, because the internal architecture didn't match the external documentation the Kaelthir had provided. The listed specifications described a passive recording unit, stripped of anything sensitive before transfer. What Bonsu found instead, sitting exactly where the documentation insisted there was only ballast, was a live receiver array the size of a dinner plate, still drawing trickle power from a decay cell the Kaelthir hadn't bothered to remove, still tuned to a band the assembly used for low-priority fleet coordination chatter. It had been listening the entire time it sat in our storage facility, on a shelf under a tarp, behind a door with a hazard rating nobody had checked in over a year. Quietly, patiently. The way a piece of technology listens when nobody expects it to still be alive. Bonsu didn't touch it further. He called Dr. Priya Anand, a cryptolinguist who'd spent the 2 years since first contact being told, gently and repeatedly and always by men who outranked her, that Kaelthir communications were unbreakable by human methods. Their encoding relied on a biological cipher keyed to their species' neural architecture. A sentence she'd heard so often she could recite it in the exact bored cadence of the man who first said it to her. Anand had spent those same 2 years quietly disagreeing, running unofficial models on intercepted survey chatter in the evenings, on hardware she wasn't technically authorized to use for the purpose. When she sat down in front of Bonsu's find, she didn't sit for long. She stood up almost immediately, walked the length of the bay twice, then sat back down on the floor because her legs had stopped cooperating with the rest of her. What she found, once the model finished its first pass, was that the probe wasn't encoding anything. It was receiving in the clear. The Kaelthir had never encrypted their low-priority fleet chatter because they'd never imagined anyone outside the assembly would be listening. They had handed us, wrapped in an insult and stamped with a disposal code, a live microphone pressed against their own supply lines. It took Anand another 4 hours to confirm what she already suspected, pacing the bay with a tablet she refused to put down, before she finally said it out loud, flat and quiet, the way people say things they've known for a while but haven't yet let themselves believe. The traffic wasn't just chatter. It was scheduling data, convoy windows, patrol rotations, the internal shorthand a fleet uses with itself when it thinks no one outside the family is listening. It took Anand and Bonsu 6 months to build a working translation model from 11 months of raw traffic, and another 2 to confirm what they were reading was real. Convoy schedules, fuel resupply windows, patrol rotations for the border sector nearest our system. Nobody told the assembly. Nobody told Vantic. We simply started listening more carefully than they had ever imagined we could, and we left the trinket exactly where they'd left it, on a shelf disposed of unimportant. Vantic's fleet arrived 4 weeks after Anand finished her model, not because the Kaelthir suspected anything, but because a border dispute with a neighboring system had pushed their patrol schedule early, and the Halloway had been sent to observe the resulting skirmish from what we thought was a safe distance. It wasn't. Vantic's escort noticed us before we noticed them, which is the part of this story I am least proud of, and the reason I was standing in his holding bay 4 hours later, being asked to make my final words count. What Vantic didn't know, standing in front of me with his patient, condescending smile, was that Anand's model wasn't sitting idle back at Compact headquarters. It had spent the last 6 hours decoding live traffic from Vantic's own flagship, the Karnath, whose boarding transponder had done us the enormous favor of opening a direct data channel the moment his Marines cut through our hull. Every system his boarding party queried, our probe's receiver quietly logged. Every coordinate his bridge crew confirmed with the relay behind him. We now had 2. His deadline for our surrender, transmitted to Compact Command an hour earlier. Comply within 6 hours or the Halloway and its crew will be disposed of as this vessel's cargo manifest permits, had given us exactly the time we needed. The Compact response fleet crossed into engagement range 11 minutes after I asked my question. 3 frigates, 41 torpedoes, no fighters because none were needed. The targeting solutions weren't ours. Our own sensors were too crude to track Kaelthir maneuvering at range. Anand's decoded telemetry feed did the tracking instead, reading the Karnath escort's own coordination chatter and handing our gunners a flight plan before the escort itself had finished executing it. The gravitational compensators went first. Bonsu had flagged them months earlier, back in the secured bay, as structurally identical to the probe's own decayed regulator, a single point of failure the Kaelthir had apparently never redesigned because no one had ever forced them to. 2 escort vessels lost stabilization inside 90 seconds. A third took torpedo fire it never saw coming because it never saw anything coming. 1 gunnery crew adjusted fast, rerouted point defense, and clipped a Compact frigate's forward shielding, the only confirmed hit the Kaelthir landed in the entire engagement. It wasn't enough. 1 escort broke formation and ran for the border. Its captain had apparently done the same math I'd done 4 hours earlier, A fight against an enemy who already knows your flight plan isn't a fight worth finishing. We let it go. There was nothing left to prove by killing a man who had already understood. The engagement lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It ended with the Karnath disabled and drifting, its weapons crews standing down under orders relayed from a bridge that had just watched an escort of 6 vessels lose 4 of them without landing more than a scratch. Vantic didn't surrender because he was afraid. He surrendered, his own log later showed, because he'd done the math and there was no version of the remaining engagement in which the math favored him. I didn't sleep for most of the 11 days between the engagement and the prisoner exchange. Not because I feared what the Kaelthir would do with the Halloway's surviving crew, since by then Vantic's own command structure had already conceded the exchange terms, but because I kept running the same 11 months backward in my head. Every meeting where I'd said nothing. Every version of that afternoon in the holding bay where I asked the wrong question instead of the right one, where the math went the other way. Nobody prepares you for how much quieter victory is than the version of it you rehearse in your head for 11 months. I sat in a debrief room afterward and cried for exactly as long as it took someone to bring me coffee. And then I stopped, because there was work to do. And because grief for the nights I hadn't slept was a luxury the next 6 months of decoded traffic weren't going to wait for. He sent me a transmission 11 days later, after the prisoner exchange, on a private channel with no assembly seal attached, which is how I knew it wasn't official before I'd even opened it. There was a long silence before he spoke, longer than the recording needed, the kind of silence a man leaves when he's rehearsed something and is no longer sure he wants to say it. When he finally did speak, his voice had none of the polish it carried in the holding bay. "Your question was audacious," he said. "I assumed a defeated species asks for mercy or asks for meaning. You asked neither. I have reviewed the transfer manifest for the probe myself. I approved it personally 11 months ago as a courtesy. I did not imagine anyone reading it would think to ask what it was still doing." A pause, and beneath the recording I could hear him deciding whether to finish the sentence. "Your assembly statute exists so the defeated may not claim ignorance of their own failure. I begin to wonder whether it should apply to us as well. I was wrong about what your species does with what it is given. I do not think I will make that mistake again." I didn't answer that transmission. I've thought about answering it several times since, and I still don't know what I'd say. What I did instead was go back to my terminal. The same terminal I'd been sitting at 11 months earlier, when nobody believed a decommissioned probe was worth a second look. And I opened Anand's model and pointed it at 6 more months of decoded Kaelthir supply traffic that had piled up while I was busy being interrogated. 2 times before this I had been right and it had cost me nothing but credit. This time, being right had cost the Kaelthir 4 ships and a flagship, and it had cost me nothing at all, which is a trade I am still getting used to. The probe is still listening. Nobody on the assembly side has thought to ask us to give it back, and I am not, under any circumstances, going to be the one who reminds them. The one who reminds them.